So my family moved into a townhouse a little while ago. The building was roughly 3 decades old and sat directly across from a primary school with a regional medical clinic a short walk away. On paper, it was an ordinary residential location. I was a kid at the time, and from the beginning I had difficulty feeling settled there. I didn't describe it as fear back then, it was more a persistent awareness of being observed, I guess, even when I was alone. Now, one recurring issue involved hearing my name called all the time. It happened often enough that it became sort of routine for me. I would be in my bedroom or another part of the house and hear my mother call for me clearly, using the same tone that she always did. I would respond verbally, sometimes more than once, before realizing that nobody else was home. I checked the house each time, but there was never any indication that someone had entered or that I had misheard a nearby conversation or the television or anything like that. There was this one time, though, that I had come home from school earlier than usual and was alone in the house. I was in the kitchen preparing some food or something. The layout included a narrow partition wall separating the walkway from the counter area, and as I turned toward that wall, I saw what appeared to be my father's face leaning around the edge, as if he was partially concealed behind it. My reaction was immediate and a little bit casual, I would say. I spoke to him, assuming that he was joking, and when I blinked, the face was no longer there. At the time, I really didn't know what to make of it. I did note one detail, though, that felt incorrect even then. The eyes appeared uniformly sort of pale, without visible pupils or contrast. I didn't tell anyone about it. In the end, I just sort of thought that maybe I imagined it. Nothing escalated after that, but smaller incidences definitely continued throughout the years that we lived there. The feeling of being watched, that never diminished. The auditory experiences persisted intermittently. And despite this, I adapted and treated the house as uncomfortable rather than threatening. I eventually moved out without giving it too much thought, and more than a decade later, during a conversation with my sister back in 2023, the subject of our childhood home came up. She asked whether I had ever liked that townhouse, and when I asked why, she explained that she had experienced her own issues there, including unexplainable sounds and also a constant sense of unease. She said that this discomfort that had played a role in her decision to leave as soon as she became an adult. We compared details and realized that although our experiences were not identical, they certainly overlapped in tone and frequency. Our parents sold the house years ago and relocated to a rural property outside of the city. Neither my sister nor I have experienced similar issues in their current home or elsewhere ever since then. No unusual events followed us after leaving, which says a lot to me, really. I think that there was something in that house, and whoever bought it, well, I hope that they're doing okay. We moved into this house in late 2022, a single-story home with a converted loft in a quiet residential neighborhood. The house was pretty small, roughly 1,000 square feet with an open main floor and a staircase leading to 2 bedrooms and a small office. I personally work from home, so I spent most of my time in the house and am pretty familiar with its layout, mechanical systems, and the ambient noises that come with it. The first incident occurred within a few months of moving in, I would say. One night, my wife and I were watching television downstairs. I went upstairs to lie down while she stayed behind to clean up a little bit. I was awake and scrolling on my phone, lying on my side and facing away from the bedroom door. I heard someone enter the room, felt the mattress shift, and felt weight settle beside me. This was obviously consistent with my wife joining me, and so I didn't react. Within seconds, I heard the kitchen sink downstairs turn on, though, and metal dishes make contact in the basin. The overlap of these two events was immediately noticeable. I turned to my side, expecting to see my wife, but the bed, it was empty. I called out to her, and she answered from the kitchen. We talked it through, and we couldn't identify a cause for this. At the time, I assumed I was just tired, and so I didn't dwell on it. Nothing similar happened for a long stretch after that too, and the incident, it mostly faded into the background. The second set of events occurred roughly a year later. My wife and I again had gone upstairs to bed at around 11 p.m. Our children were asleep, and we'd been in bed for less than 10 minutes when a loud impact sound came from downstairs. One of our children's scooters moved across the hardwood floor in the dining area at the base of the stairs. The sound was not subtle or gradual. It was consistent with a forceful movement. Both of us reacted immediately, and obviously assumed an intruder. I retrieved my firearm and we conducted a full search of the house, but there were no open doors, no disturbed entry points, and no signs of any people. We checked closets, storage spaces, the garage, everywhere, but nothing was out of place and no one was there. We returned upstairs unsettled, but assuming that we must have just misinterpreted the sound. But less than 5 minutes later, we both heard clear footfalls ascending the stairs. The cadence was steady and the sound included fabric movement consistent with clothing. It took about the same amount of time that it would take an adult to climb the staircase normally. My wife moved toward the stairwell while I followed behind, expecting to confront someone at the top, but there was no one there. There was also no sound of retreat or anything too. Given the house layout as well, it just wouldn't have been possible for someone to reach the stairs like that, reverse direction, and disappear without being heard. We checked the house again in any case, but there was nothing. At that point, we turned on all the lights and we stayed downstairs for quite some time. Eventually, we returned to bed and closed a child safety gate at the top of the stairs as a bit of a precaution, I suppose. Not that it would stop anyone. It wasn't really for security so much as it was giving an audible warning, I guess, if something did move again. But about 30 minutes later, we then heard a mechanical noise coming from the upstairs office. When I approached the door, the sound intensified, and inside the room, my laser cutter's exhaust system was running at full output. The internal fan and the external vent fan were both engaged. This was weird too, because these are controlled by physical switches that require manual input, including multiple presses to reach maximum speed. And I had not used the machine in several months. We shut everything down and disconnected the power. And after that, the night ended without any further incidences. In the days that followed, we reviewed mundane explanations though. Obviously, electrical faults, vibration, obviously memory errors or overlapping sounds. None of them, though, fully accounted for the sequence or the timing, or the fact that we both heard them. I checked wiring as well, outlets and breaker logs, but nothing showed irregular behavior. Later I learned from neighbors, though, that a previous occupant had left abruptly years earlier under unclear circumstances. No crime was documented, no investigation followed, and that information, it didn't provide any answers, and I don't attribute the events to it or anything, but it is a little bit weird. What ultimately mattered, though, was not identifying a cause, but addressing the stress response that it created in both of us. We installed interior cameras, reinforced nightly routines, and limited speculation because we were just sort of going crazy over it all. Over time, the activity didn't repeat, thankfully, and sleep normalized. The house returned to its normal, predictable behavior, I guess you could say, and I really don't know what happened that night, but it was strange. If something like that were to happen again, I think that I would document it now, address safety first, I guess, and involve professionals where appropriate too. But until then, it remains an incident without much of an explanation. And I guess that that's realistically where it's going to stay. I was enrolled in a performing arts program at a regional university some years back. During my second year there, my partner and I rented a small apartment off of campus. It was inexpensive by local standards and located in a concrete residential block built in the late 1990s. By the winter of 2024, we had lived there for almost 2 full academic years without incident. The apartment layout was pretty simple. The entrance opened directly into a combined living and dining area. A narrow corridor led to the bedroom and the kitchen, with a small bathroom between them. My computer desk faced the wall opposite the hallway, meaning the corridor was always within my peripheral vision while I worked or played video games. And over several weeks, I began noticing brief movement in that hallway. It was never fully formed or clearly defined, just sort of short, dark shapes passing quickly from one side to the other. The movement was always low to the ground and lasted less than a second. Each time I turned to look directly, there was nothing there too. I attributed the whole thing to just fatigue or screen strain from gaming or something, just normal visual processing errors, I guess. I didn't mention it to my partner because she's easily unsettled, and I had no confidence that what I was actually noticing was even meaningful. But the more significant incident occurred during preparation for a student film project that I was working on. A classmate had cast me in a short production that required an early morning call time. At that point in time in the semester, my sleep schedule had deteriorated completely as well. I was staying awake most nights and sleeping through the afternoon. Adjusting on short notice was pretty unrealistic, but it had to be done. I had access to a prescribed sedative that I had used occasionally in the past for travel-related insomnia, so I took one dose at about 6:30, expecting uninterrupted sleep throughout the night. I fell asleep quickly too. At around 9:45 p.m., I woke up from something. I was fully alert, not disoriented at all, and immediately aware of my surroundings. My partner was awake beside me, lying on her side and using her phone. The room lighting was minimal, coming only from the screen, and as my eyes adjusted, I noticed what appeared to be a human form positioned over her. It was oriented vertically, knees on the mattress, torso leaning forward. The outline suggested an elderly person based on posture and proportions. There were no sharp details, no clear facial features or clothing, but the shape was distinct enough to register as a figure rather than a shadow or reflection. My first attempt was that I was still partially dreaming when I woke up. However, I was able to speak and move slightly and register my partner's presence clearly. I verbalized a short, incomplete sentence out of reflex, and when my partner responded, I attempted to focus directly on what I was seeing. At that moment, my attention fully locked onto the figure, and it ceased to be visible. There was no motion away from the bed or change in the lighting or anything. It just simply was no longer present. The space above my partner was now empty. In the end, I chose not to describe what I had seen. I told her nothing was wrong, and I encouraged her to continue resting. My reasoning was just practical, I guess. If this was a transient hallucination linked to medication, stress, or sleep interruption, escalating it would just serve no purpose. So, later that night I checked the time and noted that less than 4 hours had passed since taking that sedative, which was very unusual based on prior use. I experienced no further disturbances that evening or that night, and so I really don't know what that was. Since moving out, I've not experienced anything similar, and I remain open to neurological or pharmacological explanations, but what I will say is that the medication that I took, it's never made me experience anything like this before, and as far as I know, it really shouldn't make anyone experience anything like this. I try not to think about it too much these days, and really, I was just glad to be out of there and to not have to go back. So this incident took place during a period when I spent a lot of time driving at night for no particular reason, other than habit really, but I wanted to share this because it's one of the few experiences in my life that I've really never been able to solve through ordinary explanation, despite revisiting it many, many times. So at the time, I was living in central Alberta, Canada, in an area dominated by farmland and sparsely populated service towns. I was dating someone then, and it was common for us to take long drives late in the evening. We worked pretty irregular hours, and driving after dark was quiet, predictable, and usually uneventful. On the night in question, we had been driving for about over an hour at this stage. The time was somewhere between 10:30 and midnight, though I cannot be more precise than that. Traffic was minimal, weather conditions were very stable, and visibility was clear aside from the expected darkness outside of the reach of the streetlights. We exited a provincial highway to pass through a small agricultural settlement at one stage, the type consisting of a grain elevator, a few houses, and one intersecting road. There were no businesses open, no pedestrians, and no other vehicles present. As we approached the intersection where the road rejoined the highway, we slowed to a complete stop, because that was when we saw it. Positioned directly in the center line of the highway, straddling the double yellow markings, was an animal, roughly equivalent in size to a large dog or maybe a small wolf. Its body posture was upright and balanced though, not crouched or defensive. It was facing our vehicle head-on, and what immediately stood out was its lack of movement. When I say that it didn't flinch, shift its weight, or turn its head as we rolled to a stop less than a car length away, I mean that it was like a statue. At first, I assumed that whatever it was injured or disoriented. However, there were no visible signs of distress, and its back was straight, its head level, and its limbs appeared stable. The fur was dark, somewhere between deep brown and charcoal, and appeared very uneven in texture, as if clumped or thinned in places, rather than uniformly shedding. As our headlights passed directly over this thing, I noticed something that triggered a strong sense of unease in me. There was no visible eye reflection. In my experience, even domestic animals produce some degree of light return when illuminated directly at night. In this case, the eyes remained flat and dark, without glint or shine or anything. The animal continued to stare at the vehicle without reacting. My partner hesitated before turning onto the highway. He did not accelerate quickly, and he didn't look away from it until we were fully past the intersection, but neither of us spoke immediately. Mind you, there was no sense of relief after passing it, which was pretty unusual, but instead I guess there was concern that it might move, follow, or behave unpredictably once we had turned our backs to it. Rather than driving directly back toward my residence too, we continued along the highway in the opposite direction for some time. We drove several additional miles and made a loop through a larger town, and waited before retracing our route. This decision was not discussed explicitly, but it was pretty clear that we were both attempting to put distance between ourselves and whatever that was. Throughout that time, we discussed possible explanations as well. Coyotes were common in the region, but their behavior did not match what we had observed. Wolves were rare and typically avoided vehicles. Domestic dogs, they didn't usually sit calmly in the center of an active highway at night, nor would they remain motionless under lights like that. When we eventually passed the intersection again, the animal was no longer there. There were no tracks or road disturbances visible from the car or anything that we could see. We never did report the incident as, well, there was just no immediate threat and nothing tangible to describe beyond an unusual animal sighting. And look, I'm not asserting that the encounter involved anything outside of known wildlife behavior. However, it just didn't align with any animal interaction that I've experienced before or since. And what remains most notable to me is not actually the appearance itself. Instead, it's the animal's complete, just lack of reaction and the instinctive response that it triggered in both of us. The event, it was over pretty quickly and nothing further occurred that night. But still, it stands out as a moment where I just don't really have an explanation for it. And that unresolved gap is the reason that it has remained fixed in my memory long after any other more dramatic experience has faded. At the time that this happened, I was visiting a close friend who was attending university in Northern California, near the Monterey Bay area. A small group of us from our hometown met up with her for a brief stop before continuing south for a longer trip, and the plan was pretty casual. Stay one night near campus, then travel to San Diego County for several days. There were 6 of us, all women, and we rented a single vehicle for convenience. The drive south was pretty uneventful. The problems began only when we checked into the short terminal rental that we had booked for 2 nights. So the house was located in a densely populated but poorly maintained residential area near a major road. Entry required unlocking a metal gate secured with a combination lock, after which a narrow driveway led to the house. The property had a detached storage structure at the rear that was listed as off-limits. The yard was pretty overgrown, and visibility from the street was pretty limited by the fencing and the vegetation. All doors technically functioned, but none felt particularly secure by any means. Inside, the layout was simple. 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a combined kitchen-living area, and an enclosed front sitting space with large windows. We used that area frequently during that evening, because it was separated from the rest of the house and felt sort of semi-private, I guess. Now, on the final night of our stay, something occurred that we initially dismissed as background noise. You see, while we were sitting there near the front of the house, we heard a sort of metal movement near the gate, consistent with a chain or maybe a latch being disturbed. No one investigated immediately, and after a short discussion, we sort of went back inside and locked the doors again. Most of the group went to bed between about 11 o'clock and midnight, and one person stayed awake in her room video chatting with someone back home. Another friend reminded us later about studying, and I went to sleep shortly after midnight, I think. Now, I must have woken up sometime at around 2:30 in the morning by someone shaking my shoulder and telling me, quietly but urgently, that something was wrong. At first, I assumed it was anxiety or maybe confusion, but I followed her into the living room where several others were now gathered, visibly distressed. Before anyone explained, we all heard distinct movement coming from the kitchen area. It wasn't a single noise, mind you, but a sequence. Light impacts, shifting objects, and what sounded like drawers being opened and closed. Nobody was speaking at that point. The source was not visible from where we were standing, but at that moment, the situation shifted from confusion to threat assessment immediately. We woke the remaining people, consolidated into one bedroom, and barricaded the door with available furniture. 2 of us stayed positioned near the door while others contacted emergency services. And while waiting, we heard additional sounds consistent with footsteps moving between the rooms. These were not constant, but intermittent, and the sounds didn't respond to us making noise, calling out, or deliberately knocking on the walls or anything. And that absence of reaction was a bit disturbing, to be honest. Law enforcement arrived after a significant delay. Entry required one of us to unlock the door from the inside. The officers conducted a brief sweep of the interior and stated that they found nothing. Their inspection appeared limited, and they initially declined to check the yard or detached structure, but after insisting, they performed a cursory exterior check and no forced entry was identified. No items were reported missing, and the officers suggested that the possibility of an animal or maybe just misinterpretation, and they left. None of us accepted that explanation, though, and within an hour we decided that we should leave. So we packed quickly and we began driving back north before dawn rather than staying another night, and no one slept during the drive. In the days following, we attempted to sort of reconstruct the timeline and maybe identify some plausible cause. The most likely explanation remains unauthorized entry by a person familiar with the property or something. Possibly somebody accessing the yard or the structure and leaving before police arrived. The lack of confrontation does not negate that possibility, I suppose, but in hindsight, our presence may have deterred escalation rather than inviting it, I guess. But since that trip, my behavior around shared lodging has changed dramatically. I now inspect entry points immediately, carry additional locking devices, and avoid properties with isolated layouts or unsecured exterior structures. And also, while I don't frame the incident as paranormal, I cannot rule that out either because, really, the person should have been there when the police arrived. It was weird, and nothing followed us after that, and no further incidents occurred on the trip. But still, the experience has sat with me all these years, and it's weird how quickly a familiar environment can become unsafe without any warning. At the time that this happened, I was studying in northern Austria, enrolled at a public university, and serving in a student coordination role responsible for organizing orientation activities for incoming students. The first weeks of the semester were always demanding, involving early mornings, logistical planning, and really, really long days on campus. But I was living alone in a privately owned residential building that was not officially designated as student housing, but was largely occupied by students due to its low rent. The building also housed long-term tenants, short-term ones, and individuals whose backgrounds were unknown to most residents. The structure itself was pretty outdated and poorly maintained, but it was good enough for me. Now, each floor was divided into sort of two corridors, separated by a heavy fire door accessed from the stairwell. This door produced a distinct, high-pitched noise when opened, which made it pretty easy to track movement on the floor. The hallway lights were permanently on here, and my apartment was a single-room unit with a bathroom, bed, desk, and a kitchenette, all arranged in pretty close proximity. The front door was pretty thin, and the peephole was unusually large compared to modern standards. Anyway, on the morning in question, I woke up shortly before 5 in the morning to prepare some food for an orientation event. After showering, I stood at my desk mirror applying some makeup. My apartment door was less than a meter to my left, while the rest of the room was extended to my right. And at some point, I heard the corridor door open. This was not unusual by any means. Residents often return late here, especially during the first weeks of term. Normally, such movement would be followed by the sound of an apartment door opening and closing within seconds. But that sound never came, which was a bit weird. Several minutes passed, and I became aware of the absence rather than the presence of noise, I guess, and the corridor was just completely silent. I continued what I was doing, but my attention had definitely shifted. I noticed a physical response too. I had light dizziness all of a sudden, tension in my shoulders, and a growing sense of alertness that I didn't experience here ever before. I turned my head toward the apartment door. The peephole, which normally showed a bright, distorted view of the hallway, was now completely dark. There was no ambiguity about what that indicates too. Someone or something was directly blocking it. At that moment, I stopped moving. I didn't approach the door or the light switch, which was mounted beside the frame. Instead, I stepped backward toward the bed and sat down against the wall where the door was no longer visible. From that position, anyone trying to look under the door or something would not have a direct line of sight into the room. I waited, and I didn't check my phone or make any noise. I didn't really know how long this lasted, but it felt extended enough to be deliberate rather than accidental. Eventually, I heard the corridor door open again and then close. The sound was pretty clear again. I waited a little bit longer, and when I finally approached the door, I listened before opening it. There were no footsteps or voices, and so I unlocked it, opened it slowly, and found the hallway empty. As I exited the building minutes later, I noticed an unfamiliar man standing near the front entrance. He appeared to be waiting rather than passing through, I suppose, but we made brief eye contact. There was no verbal exchange. His expression was neutral, not startled or evasive or anything. And only later did I consider the practical explanation for what all of this meant. You see, from the street it was possible to see when individual apartments were lit, and someone familiar with the building layout could identify which door corresponded to which unit. The peephole design allowed a clear interior view as well from the outside, at least a little bit, and it was always magnified rather than obscured, I guess you could say, but out of curiosity, days later I tested it myself. Standing in the corridor, I could see nearly the entire room through that peephole, including facial details and even hand movements. Anyone positioned there, they would have been able to observe me clearly and would have known exactly when I noticed. I was on edge for some time after that, but thankfully nothing similar happened again. That certainly didn't make the incident insignificant, as what was that guy doing there and why? But still, thankfully I finished my studies there without incident again, and I guess it was just one of those one-off things. So I had just gotten my driver's license in India and was still adjusting to driving longer distances. That evening, I planned to pick up my friend Priya, who had recently relocated to a different part of Chennai for work. It was already around 10:15 in the afternoon when I left, and the city had begun to quieten down a bit. My route took me near the Gindi Reserve Forest, a dense patch of protected land here, and I had driven past it during the day many times, and I never even considered it dangerous. At night, however, the isolation was striking. Priya and I were about halfway to my house when we noticed a figure at the edge of the road. Initially, I thought it was somebody in trouble. The man was bent over a damaged motorcycle by the looks of things, clutching his leg and sort of moaning softly too. My first instinct was to stop and try to help this guy, but something about the whole situation just felt off. Before I could process it further, movement caught my eye from the forest lining both sides of the road, and within seconds, several men appeared, emerging silently from the trees. Each of them were carrying a curved blade, and their posture, it wasn't casual. They were advancing deliberately toward the car. My adrenaline immediately surged. I didn't have time to reason. I pressed the accelerator and drove straight through the stretch, keeping my headlights on full beam. The men followed briefly, but the trees eventually obscured them. Once the forest cleared, I stopped to catch my breath a little bit. Priya sat silently, her hands gripping the seat. We both understood that we had narrowly avoided a direct confrontation, and I realized then too that the man by the motorcycle, he was the lure, a way to slow drivers down. Stopping could have seen us killed that night. After we reached a populated area, I explained the situation to my parents. They confirmed that this section of the forest had a history of criminal activity, particularly targeted travelers at night. They noted that couples, or even pairs traveling together, were especially vulnerable. Driving past without exiting the car had likely prevented a violent encounter for us, and for that, I am thankful. So, to anyone traveling alone through remote areas at night, my advice: stay alert, avoid unnecessary stops, and be aware that danger can appear in forms that seem ordinary at first glance. I will never forget the way that the forest fell so silent, except for those few figures emerging from the shadows. And I also know that I will never take that stretch again. I never really thought of my job as risky. At 19, I was working late shifts at a large warehouse retailer, close enough to home that the drive never felt like a concern at all. The store environment was pretty busy, predictable, and sort of familiar, I guess. I trusted the people that I worked with too, and that sense of routine is part of why I didn't recognize a problem immediately, I think. During the cleanup period, following a major seasonal sales event, The store had closed to customers, but the floor was still in disarray. I was assigned to straighten and restack apparel tables near the back half of the sales floor, and while working, I noticed a man standing several aisles away. He wasn't browsing, and he was stationary and oriented sort of toward me. At the time, I assumed he was waiting for assistance or unsure where to go or something, which was common during the closing procedures. So I approached him and asked whether he needed some help finding a size or an item or something. His response was hesitant and unusually high in pitch, but not overtly alarming or anything. I retrieved the item that he requested, and instead of disengaging afterward, he remained nearby and initiated personal conversation. He commented on my appearance and asked about my background, and attempted to continue the interaction beyond anything work-related. I didn't challenge this directly. I was pretty tired, I guess, focused on just finishing my shift, and incorrectly assessed him as socially awkward rather than threatening. Anyway, as closing announcements began, he asked for my social media contact. I provided it with no intention of follow-up. In hindsight, though, this was a huge lapse in judgment, driven by exhaustion and also misplaced politeness. After the store cleared, I met with a coworker that I trusted near the employee exit. I mentioned the interaction casually and told her the name that he had given me. Her reaction changed immediately, though. She asked to see his profile, and after a brief look, she contacted a supervisor without explanation. What followed was a structured questioning process. Management asked for a physical description, the nature of his comments, and whether he had approached me alone. Only then was I informed that the man was known to the store. Apparently, he was a former employee, dismissed after repeated boundary violations involving another staff member or something. According to management, he had monitored work schedules, returned to the store outside of business necessity, and continued contact despite being told to stop. Policy changes, including the removal of printed schedules, had been implemented just because of him. At that point, the situation was reframed for me. This was not a single uncomfortable interaction. It fit an established pattern with this guy. I was escorted to my vehicle that night. While standing with my supervisor and coworker in the parking lot, I received a message from him asking whether I lived nearby and whether I was alone. Under instruction, I replied that I lived with others and declined further contact. I blocked him once I was home, and honestly, I thought that was that. Out of concern rather than curiosity, I reviewed publicly available information about him too. He appeared to have a spouse and children, I think. I considered reaching out, but was advised that a previous attempt by another employee had been dismissed and caused additional distress without resolution, apparently. In the weeks that followed, he returned repeatedly too. He came during different shifts and asked for me by name. Each time, co-workers redirected me to non-public areas. This became an informal but coordinated response: walkie-talkies, temporary reassignment, and silent signals when he entered the building. No announcement was ever made over the system, but awareness spread organically among the staff, I think. One incident, though, stands out above everything. So, I was crossing departments when I noticed him ahead of me at one point. Before I could change direction, a co-worker signaled urgently, and I moved into the jewelry department and took cover behind the counter while an older associate engaged him. He asked whether a specific employee from apparel was working that day, describing me in terms that reduced me to age and ethnicity. My co-worker denied that I was there and maintained conversation until he left the department, and I remained out of sight for over an hour afterward. The most difficult aspect was uncertainty outside of the building, though, because on several nights an unoccupied vehicle remained parked with lights off until I exited. I cannot confirm that it was him, but the pattern aligned too closely to ignore it for sure. So I adjusted my schedule, varied my exit routes, and avoided leaving alone whenever possible. After approximately 5 months of doing this as well, The visits, they finally stopped. Mind you, no explanation was ever given and the behavior just simply ceased. I never pursued legal action too because at that age, I just lacked the clarity and the emotional bandwidth to escalate the situation beyond immediate safety, I guess. Instead, I relied on collective awareness and informal protection from co-workers, which was good enough, I suppose, but in hindsight, I probably should have done more. What stayed with me, though, was not the fear in the moment, but the delayed understanding of just how easily my environment could change like that. The experience definitely changed me and how I assess people, personal boundaries, workplace dynamics, all of that. And thankfully, like I said, it seemed like eventually he just gave up, but still, every now and then I still find myself looking over my shoulder and wondering if maybe he'll come back one day. I sure hope not. In the early 1980s, my mother and her siblings lived with their parents in a sort of row-style duplex in southern Ontario outside of Hamilton. The building, it dated back several decades and had been modified repeatedly over the years. Both units shared a continuous basement with a low-crawl corridor running beneath the dividing wall. The space was pretty unfinished, packed dirt floor, exposed joists, and uneven wooden supports. Access was through a loose panel near the laundry area. The adults did not use the space for storage at that time, and as a result, the children treated it as a bit of a play area. They brought down flashlights, old toys, and pieces of cardboard and spent long stretches of time there, especially during the winter months. According to everybody involved, the crawl space had been cleared beforehand and was not a place where items were regularly added or removed or anything. And at some point during this period, while moving dirt near the back section of the crawl corridor, the children uncovered a floorboard made of compressed cardboard printed with letters and symbols. It was not in packaging and showed signs of age and moisture exposure. None of the children recognized it immediately, but an older sibling identified it as a spirit board after seeing the alphabet layout. No one admitted to bringing it into the house, and there was no obvious reason that it could have been buried under the dirt floor like that. Despite limited understanding of what it was, the children experimented with it briefly, treating it like a game rather than a ritual. This ended quickly, though, once their mother became aware of it. She was strict, religious, and not inclined to investigate or debate anything. She removed the board immediately, cut it into sections using household scissors, and disposed of the pieces into separate trash bags. She also restricted access to the crawl space for several days afterward. Now, the matter would likely have ended there if not for what happened later that week. When the children were allowed back into the basement, they returned to the crawl space, and near the same rear section where the board had originally been found, they noticed a single piece of printed cardboard resting on top of the dirt. It was dry, intact, and not buried. The fragment contained one large printed character, the capital letter I. Mind you, this was not noticed all at once. One child pointed it out, assuming someone had dropped it. Then others denied it, and when their mother was shown the fragment, she recognized the font and the color immediately as part of the original board. She searched the basement trash bins and outdoor garbage containers, but didn't find the remaining pieces. From a practical standpoint, several explanations were considered later: that a piece had been missed during the disposal, that maybe an animal had dragged it back inside, or that it had fallen from another unit through the shared structure. But none of these explanations fully satisfied the adults in the end, especially at the time, particularly because the crawl space had no direct exterior access and the fragment showed no dirt or tearing consistent with being moved mechanically like that. The mother interpreted the fragment symbolically rather than literally. She didn't think of it as a paranormal thing or anything, but just as evidence that the object itself had not been fully removed in the end. Her reaction was pretty procedural. She contacted a local priest, had the basement blessed, and sealed off the crawl space permanently using plywood and some screws. Life in the house continued, but my mother later reported a persistent sense of unease tied specifically to that basement afterward. She also described hearing what she described as like a knocking sound coming from the floors beneath her feet. Mind you, there should not have been anyone down there, and she described it as if somebody had taken like a broomstick and just started bashing the floor above them. She also said that at times she could have sworn that she saw the lights being turned on down there, but there was no one down there, so she didn't know how that was even possible. The laundry was always done quickly after that. The sealed panel was also never reopened. Years later, though, when the house was sold, contractors discovered remnants of like old printed cardboard embedded in the dirt beneath the sealed area, all over the place apparently. By then, most of it had deteriorated, so they couldn't tell what it was, but that original incident had already become fixed in the family memory, and so they assumed that maybe it was more Ouija boards or something like that. Now, whether that was the case or not is hard to say, but still, it was simply an object that appeared where it should not have been, and weird things happened afterward that the family had never experienced before, which is a little bit odd, right? So, I'm not presenting this as like proof of anything supernatural, paranormal, or otherwise. It's just simply an account of an event that didn't line up with what I could reasonably explain, then or now, and I thought that I should share it. So, this occurred in the early 2000s when I was in middle school, in a suburban area outside of Iowa. One of my closest friends, her name was Emily, lived in a residential development that had been built near land that used to be farmland, and also some wooded acreage too. Local stories circulated about the area having a long history, including displaced settlements and old cemeteries, but there were more community rumors than documented facts, I guess you could say. Emily's house was large though, well maintained and occupied by a pretty stable family. Her mother worked from home and was a very routine-oriented sort of person. Her father traveled frequently for work, and the house itself didn't appear neglected or unstable in any way. I spent many weekends there over several years, often staying overnight for school-related activities or group sleepovers. I was familiar with the layout too, the daily routines of the family, and the sounds and the ins and outs of the house. Now one night, Emily hosted a sleepover with several friends. Her father was away on a business trip, which was pretty common and known to everybody present. We set up sleeping arrangements in Emily's bedroom using air mattresses and sleeping bags. I ended up positioned sort of closest to the bedroom door, which was left open as it always was at night. At the top of the staircase outside of her room, the family kept a large floor fan running continuously. The stated purpose was airflow and ambient noise, but it also masked normal household sounds, I guess. Now, I had difficulty falling asleep that night. I was fully awake and aware and not drifting in and out or anything, just sort of bored, I guess. When at some point I distinctly heard a bedroom door open across the hall, followed by footsteps moving toward the stairs. The sound pattern was pretty familiar to me, actually. The hallway floor creaked in predictable places, and two of the stair treads produced consistent noise regardless of how lightly they were stepped on. I heard those exact sounds in sequence too, followed by footsteps descending. Based on the timing, context, and the absence of any other adults in the house, I assumed it was Emily's mother going downstairs. This didn't alarm me at the time, obviously. Morning routines often started early in that house after all. But later, still awake, I began hearing activity down in the kitchen. Cabinet doors, utensils, and general movement, consistent with food preparation, I guess. Again, this sort of matched what I expected Emily's mother to do, cooking breakfast every time that I stayed over, and the sounds were pretty familiar. So at that point, I assumed it was early morning, though I had no way to check the time. What caused concern for me, though, was the delay. The kitchen sounds continued intermittently for a long period, and eventually, daylight became visible through the windows, and I sort of shifted position so that I could see the staircase clearly, expecting Emily's mother to come back upstairs to wake everyone. But instead, I eventually saw her emerge from her bedroom across the hall and walk towards the stairs for the first time that morning. Now, I want to be clear that there is no confusion what happened here, with regard to Emily's mother, I mean. I watched her open her door, step into the hallway, and proceed to the staircase. The fan was still running, the house lighting conditions were still normal by early morning, and she then walked down the stairs. At that moment, the inconsistency became very clear. I had already heard her do this earlier, including the same stair noises, without her returning upstairs in between. Shortly after she went downstairs, food smells became noticeable for the first time as well, specifically breakfast items that would require active cooking. When she later came back upstairs to wake us, her behavior was normal and consistent with routine. I didn't say anything at the time because, honestly, I didn't know what to say. Nothing else occurred that morning. No one reported hearing or seeing anything unusual. I sort of checked lightly with people. I also mentioned it briefly years later and was told that she had slept through the